Hey, my name is James Davis, and I just happen to be in town. I actually live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I work for something called the Center for Open Science. We use Ember for the front end of something called the Open Science Framework. It's actually an open source app. I am the front end lead there, and we've been using TypeScript with Ember for a little over 2 years now, I think. That we've been doing that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about typing Octane. So Octane changes a few things, and I'm just going to talk about that. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is Yarn 2. So for anybody who's not in the know, there's lots of rage over Yarn 2. And I'm talking about it because it breaks a lot of things, including trying to do TypeScript with Ember and TypeScript and lots of things. The reason it breaks things, just real quickly, is there's no more node modules. There's a thing called plug and play. It's this new magical thing, but TypeScript needs to look at node modules to find type declarations. There's a thing called PNPify that kind of makes it work. It's kind of thing. But anyway, basically, yeah, no guarantee for now. So that brings me to the next thing, my favorite tool, Volta. So if anybody's not using Volta, use Volta, because you can pen to the version of Yarn, so you won't accidentally, one dev end up on Yarn 2 and wipe out everything and mess you up. You can also pen node and all that stuff, so go for that. Okay, so using TypeScript with Octane. So same thing, install Ember CLI TypeScript. How many of y'all have used TypeScript with Ember before? Some-ish, okay. I'm not gonna go into too much detail about it. I don't have time to really do all of it, but talk mostly about the things that are different in Octane, but I can fill in. You can talk to me later if you want to know more about it. So that's the first thing you do. The next thing you do is you throw out the blueprints. And I thought this blueprint of the trash can was appropriate here. So the reason you do this is because the blueprints, which we moved at one point into its own package called Ember CLI TypeScript Blueprints. I forgot to mention, there's like an unofficial Ember CLI TypeScript team. It's me and Dan Freeman, who works at Salsify, but lives in, where's he live? Switzerland, yeah. Anyway, and Chris Kreitschel, Mike North is kind of an ex officio member. Anyway, that maintain this. So when I say we, that's the we I'm talking about. So we maintain that, Ember CLI TypeScript and type definitions and things like that. So anyway, the reason you throw these away is because they were created pre-Octane. They sort of got you there so that you could do, anyway, they're just no good, basically, at this point. And so whatever package manager you use or whatever, remove them because they will just get in your way. So you're probably asking, well, how do I get TypeScript things then? What blueprints did, for those of you who don't know, is they actually basically replaced pretty much all of the blueprints from Ember Core for generating components and whatnot. But do a TypeScript version of them. But the thing is you actually don't need them in most cases anymore because you just do this. And with Ember Octane, the JavaScript file that it creates, because it's using ES6 classes and things like that, it's really pretty much what you want for TypeScript. There's a few things missing, like we're using Ember data. There's a model registry thing, a types registry for Ember data that you would have to set up manually. But the good news is we're actually working on this problem too. We realized the error of our ways of trying to replicate every single blueprint. And so we're actually going to have a solution that uses the native blueprints and then does a code mod on top of them to add the things that it needs for TypeScript, which will be much more maintainable because it's a maintainability nightmare otherwise. Okay, so another tip that people have stumbled across is you need to install the Lunar Tracking package. So interestingly enough, when you do Ember New with Ember 3.15, you don't get this package. This works, and unfortunately, it's hard to see, but import tracked. So tracked is how in Ember Octane we do things. It works. Magic, and I don't see Rob Jackson. He said he was going to be here, so he could explain how that works. But it works without the package. I think it's coming from another package that gives you that module. But TypeScript doesn't like it, and that's because the type definitions for Lunar Tracking are not there unless you actually install the Lunar package. So you actually need to get that into node modules there. So that's just a little tip several people have stumbled over. So I'm going to talk about components because that's the main thing that's changed and Ember Octane full TypeScript wise is that now we're using Ember components and they're a little bit different. So this is a basic component here. We have a button to increment, decrement the count. We'll track property for the count and 2 actions here. We invoke those actions and spread press. So, this looks like JavaScript, and it is, but it's also TypeScript. If you rename the file, like I showed earlier, this is TypeScript, and it's actually well typed already, just by itself. For example, if you try to do something like this, you would actually get a type error that says, count must be a number, here where we initialized it, so you can't assign a non-number to that. So without any extra information, you get for free, basically, by just renaming your file and installing the rest of the TypeScript. But component args, when we start talking about the args, when you invoke the component, you have to add a little bit of extra information. So this is actually okay right here. So I just created a little component that just has an action for logging the component args. And it actually is okay with this because we're not doing anything special with the args. We're just spitting them out. The reason it doesn't complain about args not being a property on this is because component that we extend from has a property called args already defined. But as soon as we do something like this, we're going to get an error. And this is the error it would give. This property foo does not exist on type empty object. And so it's complaining here that we're trying to access something. So this tells us something, okay, component thinks that args is an empty object. Yeah. Okay, so the way we get around this is we type it. So I'm showing you this, but this is not how we do it. This is an example of what not to do. But this is what you might think that you should do. Is that, okay, well, I need to provide a property here and give it some type information. The first thing that will happen is you'll actually get this error that says no initializer. This basically says you created a property here, but you never set it. You never initialized it in the constructor or otherwise, and so it complains about that. There is a way to fix that, which is this guy, the non-null assertion operator, which basically says, I know better than you, TypeScript, this will be set. But that's actually not the way we should do it. There's actually a new syntax in TypeScript 3.7 called declare. Well, declare is not a new keyword, but declare on a property is a new thing in TypeScript 3.7, which this basically just says, this is type information. I'm not actually creating a property here. I'm just saying, this is type information here. There's a property called args. This is actually not the best way to do it either. But I'm showing you because these are things that people have attempted that we've seen. And so I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to talk about constructor args a little bit. So if you've done any Octane, with Glimmer components, the way, we don't have a init, we don't have all these other lifestyle hooks. The way you set things up is with the constructor. So in JavaScript, it might look like this. So this is just a thing that just logs out the args. So the args get passed, the owner and the args get passed to the constructor. You must always call super, otherwise bad things happen. And we just log them out. But of course, in TypeScript, it's not going to be very happy with this. And so you got to give it some type information. So one way to do that, I've typed owner is unknown here, partially because we don't actually care what owner is. It's a sort of intimate API stuff here. There's things you can do with it, but we don't care what owner is here. We're just interested in args, so we're going to type it unknown. If you're not familiar with TypeScript, unknown is a special type that means basically that. I don't know what this is. You would have to do a type assertion, some sort of a test to figure out what it is to be able to call it another type. So some type information on args here. So that would allow this to compile, but it's also not the best way. So if we put like all these things together, you'll see, okay, well, we've done this here and we have this here. Well, what I've done here is I've moved args out to an interface. This just makes it so we don't have to repeat this here, right? Because this is really the same thing. This is args. One of the things this super does is it actually sets the args property on Glimmer components. And I guess I forgot, how many people have done Octane and Glimmer components? Probably should have pulled that first. Okay, most of you. So you're familiar with this.args on Glimmer components. Okay. But actually, there's a better way to do it. There's a better way. So it turns out that the Glimmer component base class, the types for it actually look something like this. It's kind of a simplified version. But it has this thing here that's a generic. And so args extends empty object equals empty object. So that's where that empty object was coming from when we didn't define anything. But what this does is it makes it so we can actually do this. We can actually define an interface for our args, pass that in as a type parameter to component, and then this args property will be set, and then also the constructor args here. And so that actually kind of guarantees that we don't mess up here and pass something wrong to super. So we do have to use it here if we're doing constructor args here. But then this .args.foo just works because we passed this interface in and it sets args to that. And so another nice thing, I didn't illustrate it here, that you can do something we do a lot, like in our app, is we, just with comments, we annotate which are required arguments, which are optional arguments. For components, we just kind of annotate that. And when you define an interface like this, you can use the question mark, which means it can be undefined. And so you kind of get a very nice, like, human readable, I mean, you're defining the interface for your component. We don't have typing and templates yet. It's, I don't know, Chris and Dan and I talked about sitting down at EmberConf and just hacking it out. We might see how far we can get. We all have ideas and we've all experimented a little bit to make it work. But, you know, if you have an interface defined for a component, it actually gets pretty, well, not easy, but easier to kind of match against that interface when you would build the component. So, Octane Guides for EmberCLI TypeScript are coming. They're in progress. We have been publishing them as we go. You can either remember that URL, or just if you go to embercli-typescript.com, click the little drop down over here and go to the Octane Docs version. They're definitely incomplete, but Chris Kreitzer is doing work on them, and I've jumped in and started writing a lot of those too. So for all the other pieces I didn't talk about here, services and various things, it's kind of, if you look at the old EmberCLI TypeScript docs, they were not that great. So we're actually trying to do a really good job with them this time. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Questions?
I'm sorry if I'm,
Yes.
this is expressing too much ignorance, but I just don't understand what TypeScript has ever, what does it give to the person who's developing an Ember app? Why exactly should we be typing our, the components that we make and things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it gives you a number of things. One thing it does is type safety, which is basically, you know, if you're going to use, it comes in really handy, like if you're doing, like, let's say, Ember data models, and then you're using that model in a component. If it's well typed, you can't use it wrong, basically. The properties on that model will have types, and if you try to assign something into that property that doesn't match the type, it won't even compile. So that's, you know, a good example. It will give you, in most editors, they have a really good rich autocompletion, because if the object that you're using is well typed, it knows what all the properties are and what their types are. So it works really well for that. Yeah, it just gives you like another, you know, there's a class of tests that are testing like that things are the right types, you know, that you may, I'm not going to say they replace it, but you may not need as many of those. And it's just it's a developer tool that gives you some safety when you use things, whereas JavaScript kind of, you just find out at runtime if you use it.
So are there downstream benefits other than like not letting users run into errors for you? But are there downstream benefits after the app's been built because it's built with using types, or is it?
So TypeScript doesn't actually affect runtime at all. And in fact, like the way that, so we used to use the TypeScript compiler to change TypeScript into JavaScript, but as of Babel 7, there's actually a transform for that, and the Babel transform just actually removes all the type information. It just throws it away and turns it back into regular JavaScript. So it actually has no runtime benefit. The whole benefit is at compile time, at build time. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
I was just going to ask if you have a good way of typing Ember Concurrency tasks.
So we actually have a pretty decent way we're doing it. So the big problem with Ember Concurrency tasks.
Can you actually say why they're hard?
Okay, so they're hard because they're generator functions is really one of the big problems. And the way you do it now in Octane, you use a decorator, you have a task decorator. So decorators currently cannot actually affect the type of the thing you decorate. So if you decorate a property or a generator function and say, this is a task, you say at task generator function. That's still a generator function. And anybody who's used Ember Concurrency knows that you need to .perform an Ember Concurrency task. And if you try to do that, then TypeScript says there's nothing called .perform on a generator. I don't know what that is. So one workaround that we're actually using live, I think there was an alpha version published of Ember Concurrency decorators. I'm trying to look at his name. Jan, right? Bush Towns. Yeah. How do you say his name? Jan. Is it Jan?
I think it's Jan.
Jan. Okay. I butchered his name. Sorry, Jan. He and I kind of went back and forth, and we worked out a way that basically it's a little redundant. So you say like at task, and then you say task, and you pass the generator function, and that task is basically a pass through, but it fixes the type information for you, and it works. Like we're using it. Yeah, we probably should revisit that at some point or whatever. But yeah, we're hoping one day that the TypeScript team will decide to actually make it so decorators can't affect the type because they do change the type of things, actually. They have the power to do that. They're just still considered an experimental feature. And so I think they're waiting for it to get into at least stage 3, which we didn't quite get there last time. So, yeah. Yes. Thank you.
When are types going to land in Mirage.js?
Oh, so soon. Yeah, very soon. So, their types exist. There's some in our open source repo, a few ARGs. So the official types are coming. I can't remember it. Zoltan's name. Yeah, actually, I met him at EmberConf before. He's a nice guy from New Zealand. And he actually opened up a PR to add official types to Mirage.js. And then several people, including myself and Dan Freeman and Chris Krycho, have been taking a look at them. I think he based them on something that Dan created. So Dan kind of bowed out and said, you guys look at these. But they're a good start and they need some polish. One of the things that we've really tried to do is to encourage when people want to add types to loop us in, just not that we know everything, but we've been doing it a while and kind of know a lot of the pitfalls. And we've had types get published that broke a lot of things for TypeScript users, and then we had to kind of get in there and fix them and stuff. So we try to be cautious, but also encouraging because there's a lot of packages out there and they need types. So, yeah. Yes. All right. Thank you.
All right. So next up is Ed. While Ed is getting set up, we have gourmet hot chocolate. Please acquire sugar and pizza and beer and what? I want.
Well, just showing code mostly. What do we do with the mic?
It
balance it
can
maybe?
be in just your general.
I am plugged in. Do I need to do anything? Okay. Oh, I'm just asking if you could put me on the screen then. Is there something I have to do?
Oh, sure. This it's not happy. Let's try this.
Yeah, I really like it. It's, I would say it's fun.
It's not finding another display.
Was that the adapter?
It's the same one that
Yeah,
was
no, I mean,
just used.
like pretty much everyone.
Hi, I'm Ed. My topic today is going to be a quick example of, it's inspired by two things. One is some questions people have asked about, they have examples of components that they have in their existing apps, and they're not exactly sure how to rewrite those as a Glimmer component. The second thing is making you aware of some new things that are being proposed in some RFCs right now and how they relate to the first question. So now, firstly, of course, if you've got regular Ember components, and you don't have to rewrite them all right now to Glimmer components, everything is fully supported. There's no end of life planned or anything like that. So there's no rush to take all your existing components and rewrite them to Glimmer components. But of course, it's nice to use Glimmer components when you have the chance to. They give you a lot of nice ergonomic benefits. And so people are naturally asking the question, how do I convert things from what I had to my new thing? So I've put together a little toy application here that's going to just give us a way to play with some of those patterns. And all it has is it's got a route. Actually, let me start on my. So this app actually has several different routes, and they're really all the same thing, but implemented in different ways. So we'll do starting example, starting on number 1, and this is station number 1, Charles MGH, and this is just a little app that lets you walk through the T by going from adjacent station to adjacent station. So we can go from Park Street to Downtown Crossing and State and etc. And I don't have them all in here. I didn't type in all the stations, but you can get. So that's the basic idea. And the point of this was to have one route that has an ID, and that's going to load the individual models for each of these stations as you step through them. And so the way it works, my first version here is implemented by the person who asked me this, the people who, this is kind of a stylized example based on some questions people have asked. And so this first example is based on code that somebody showed and said, how do I rewrite this component as a Glimmer component? So the way they implemented this one, starting example route, was, so the route itself just returns the ID. It doesn't load the data, right? And this is because in their particular example, they really needed to load data in a component. And so their actual component, starting example station, does the loading of the data. And so they set it up like this. How does that look? Pretty good? That looks pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I'm going to go to light mode because on a projector, you really are better off with light mode. I don't know, where's it hide? I don't remember. Who can tell me? Where do I go to light mode? Theme. There we go. Light. See, on projectors, no.
It's probably.
I think on a projector, it's actually better because you get more photons out of the projector. Like you can't project black, right? Whoa, sorry. Leaning near my funny mic stand. This is how this person implemented it, and it works just fine. And so it uses the did receive adders hook, so that which is going to run anytime the arguments to this component change. The argument we care about is the ID that we've been passed, and because every time that ID changes, we're going to fetch our data from the API, and we're going to wait till we get a response. And once we have a response, we're going to set it as our station. Right? And then, of course, we can use that data to render all the stuff. And so the equivalent component here is actually, I'm delegating to all of my examples. You have the same kind of actual display component that is just like the template and that takes care of drawing all the stuff. That thing's just called station. But so once we've loaded up the actual station data, we can pass it into station here. And this other little argument, it's not super important, but to the point of what I'm talking about, it's just there because this little station component we're going to use again and again and again, and it needs to be able to link to the next station. But I want to keep using it in the same in a particular route. So our station, because our station component looks like, this is just all the things where we show its name and which lines it's on and its neighboring stations. And here's where we actually need to know which route to link to, because I'm going to, if I'm using my starting example here, I want to stay on the starting example when I go to different stations. And then when I'm in other examples, they're going to also stay on that implementation. So that's the basic setup. And so the question was, how do I convert this to a Glimmer component? Because Glimmer components don't have did receive adders. Right? And so actually, the question started with a slightly different intro, because the person said originally they tried to do it this way. Their component, they tried to make it work like this. All right, so they tried it that way. Did I get that?
You can pass the ID into this load station.
No, I don't.
No.
I don't know. They tried to do it this way, and this actually does work, or I expected it to. But
Do you want init?
yes, I wanted init. Thank you. I'm mixing up my. There we go. Thank you. All right. So this does kind of work. Like I can load the page on station 4 and get cell station here, but then when I click, I clicked, but it didn't change. The URL changed, but I can go to station 2 manually in the URL. I can go to station 3 manually in the URL, and it goes there. But if I click on a link, it doesn't work. The URL changes, but the code, the page doesn't redraw, right? So the reason that's happening here is that the router's doing its thing. It knows that the URL has changed, but because I'm on the same exact route with the same exact component that was there before, it doesn't actually tear it all down and make a new component. All it's doing is changing the argument to my component. All right, so that when I click on these links, I'm changing the ID that my component gets, but I'm not like tearing it down and starting again, which is why the constructor or init is not going to run again. And so we're never going to do this work again. So the person who asked this question originally did figure out that if they use did receive adders instead, then it does work, because did receive adders is going to run every time we have a new ID. Right? So, but their question, okay, of course, was how do I turn this into a Glimmer component? Now, the first thing I'm going to do is show not how to go all the way to Glimmer component, but I'm actually going to show a way to refactor this first, even in classic Ember component, so that it doesn't need did receive adders, because this is an example of doing something imperative when we could have done something declarative. And what I mean by that is did receive adders is a fairly blunt instrument. It's going to run anytime any argument changes, and it's really going to be up to you to make a decision that says, yeah, whenever any argument changes, I want you to do these things. That's imperative. I'm saying do these things. The declarative alternative is to say what you need and let the system decide when to run it and how to get it. And so I'm going to switch to the next example, which is called declarative example. And all of these, like running the code is not super interesting because they all look exactly the same. So I'll show this one, and after that I'm going to stop showing because they all look exactly the same, which is the point. So the declarative example component, well, that's the route. It has Declarative Station as its component. Here's a rewriting of their component. It still has the same load the station function here, but we now have a station computed property, and we don't have did receive adders anymore. And so this is another way to think about the problem. And what we've done instead is now made it so that we still have a this.station, right? In our template, declarative station.hps, we can still just access this.station. And of course, I'm still passing it to the same underlying shared component that just draws all the stuff. But all I have to do is say this.station, that's still a value, but now it's a value that's computed on demand when I need it. And the first time I try to access it, this computed is going to run its getter, which is actually going to kick off the loading. And just like was true before, while that's running, I don't actually have a station. My station is null or undefined. In this case, I said null while it's loading. But then when this gets to the end and it says a set on that station, our station is a computed property with a setter. So it's going to come into here and it's going to say, yep, that station is whatever you set it to. So this is a different pattern that is now totally declarative. We don't need any lifecycle hooks. And it has some benefits. In addition to not needing did receive adders, which makes it easier to convert to a Octane way of thinking, it doesn't, now it really will only run when the the things we need change. Right? If the ID changes, it's going to actually know that station is invalid. The getter is going to run again. It's going to kick off a new load, etc. So that has some benefits. Now, both the previous example and this example have actually a ton of problems hiding in them. And if you've ever seen any of the talks about why you should use Ember Concurrency, they go into more detail about those problems. The examples are that all of these have uncontrolled asynchrony, meaning that lots of things can happen while you're awaiting this fetch or the response turning into JSON. While you're waiting for it, the user could switch the ID to another ID and start a second fetch that happens at the same time. And then the two are going to race to see which one shows up on the page. Or the component could actually get torn down because the user leaves entirely. And then you come back and you're calling set on a component that's been destroyed and Ember throws an exception. So there's a bunch of things here that are simplified for the teaching examples. And I just wanted to point out that those are an issue. I also want to point out that, of course, all of this complexity is only happening because in this situation, the user insisted on loading data in a component instead of in a route. I do have, and I'm not saying that's bad. I think there are legitimate reasons why you need to do that. But this toy example is too simple where you really don't need to do that. And I just want to show that I do actually have a use the router example, which this is moving it right into a route. Here's the route that could just do the same loading we did before. Very simple. And then our station is just the model. And then there's no step 2, right? It's very, very simple. Those 2 files I showed you are all you need. A lot of the complexity is gone when we trust the router to do our data loading for us. So I included this example because it is important always to consider that as option one. And only if there's some complicated reason why you can't load it through the router should you take on more complexity of loading data in the components. So now that we've converted to a more declarative version, let's take this and rewrite it as Octane. Right? So Octane Station is my new version of this component. And I've done it somewhat literally similar to the last one. And it has some things that get simpler and some things that get a little, well, I think all of it is relatively clear. Some of it gets a little more explicit in Octane. So I've done it again with a declarative way, right? We don't have to receive adder, so we have to do something declarative. Our station is now a getter and not a computed. And one thing about using a getter, and the reason this getter is going to update at the right time is because of track properties in Octane, right? We have something called cached station here in our component that is tracked, and when it changes, that's going to let Ember know there's re-rendering that needs to happen, which is going to include also rerunning the getter and things like that. The reason we need this cache station ourselves is because a big difference between using a getter with track properties here and using computeds in the classic Ember is that computeds always also include caching. They always include memoization so that they will remember the last value used and not rerun again. That's not built into getters with track properties for intentional reasons. It's actually not always necessary. Sometimes you actually pay more cost in caching everything all the time when you should really only focus on the places where you need it. And you, the author of a component, often know better about exactly how a thing should be cached anyway than Ember does. So that's why in these track properties, it does push some of this off onto the developer to be a little more explicit with it. And so we keep our own cache. And here we're able to do the kind of check we'd want to do to make sure, is my cache still valid? Here's where we say, if we've already loaded the station and it's the same as my ID, then we're just going to keep using it. Otherwise, we're going to kick off the load. And when we do the load, when it gets done, it's just going to set cache station. So a nice Glimmer implementation of this pattern that works pretty good. Again, this one still has those same concurrency issues, right? So to get really bulletproof in a production application, you'd want to do a lot more. Either go directly to using a library like Ember Concurrency or one of the others that helps with data loading. Or, if you're going to do it manually, you got to keep track of a bunch of things like checking that the component isn't destroyed before you set cached, and keeping track of races and deciding which one should actually do the set and things like that. That's beyond the scope of this talk. This talk's not really about the pitfalls of concurrency so much as the imperative and declarative patterns in Octane. So what else have I got for examples? That's the Octane example. We have one more. And so my final example is going to actually take this Octane one and compress it down to a very simple thing, which hope you'll think is cool. Use Decorator Station. Looks like this. And this is a thing that works and updates just as well as the previous one did. In fact, this one can actually get all that other stuff right in terms of handling destruction, handling races, if it's implemented right inside of here. Now, my implementation is actually kind of simple. It doesn't do those things, but there's a place in there to do it. And I'd like to just give you a quick preview of what this kind of thing even is and why it's cool. This is all public API. I'm going to share the code. It's already on GitHub. You can check out how it works if you're curious. I'll just show that it works. Use Decorator example. It works the same. It all just does the right thing. It updates correctly. This is a really nice declarative pattern. And this takes us back to the theme, right? Because the more you can just say what you want and not how to get it, the more you can keep the complex parts filed away in a library where you can invest in getting all the bugs fixed once in that library and then use it throughout your application in a way that's really clear. So I think this kind of a pattern is a big win. It involves two things. There's a use decorator, and then there's a resource here. I'll call it a resource. And my terminology is going to be based on the fact that I'm piggybacking here off work by Chris Garrett, who has written an RFC called the Use Resources RFC. And I'm taking these names directly out of his RFC and all the patterns. I did do my own quick little implementation here in this app. It doesn't depend on any other things, and it does work in existing Octane. So there's the two pieces here really. The use decorator is really kind of just a nice shorthand for setting up a resource that you want on your component. And that resource can do a lot of things. It basically means that you can have a thing that has its own life cycle to it. It knows when to start. It knows to stop if the component gets destroyed. It knows how to maintain its own state inside in the meantime and react to changes to any of these arguments that we've passed into it. All that stuff is stuff that can be handled by a resource like this that self-contained has its own little state machine inside. And so the idea is that the proposal is that a use will be built into Ember. That's what the RFC says. There'll be a use decorator from Ember. And there's a protocol for how you implement a resource like this. And you could implement resources for lots of things. You can have timers and like fault tolerance for like catching and error handling and fetching data, of course. And things like Ember Concurrency could then use this for a syntax that is actually probably more typable, actually, following up on the previous stuff. Because the type of this function now gets to determine totally the type of this property. And the decorator there is really just there as a way for us to mark visually to the user that that's what's happened here. We've set up a resource that's a little bit special and to make the implementation work. So I'll give a quick preview of how it works, and I'm definitely going to share the code as well. So the use decorator, it doesn't do that much stuff. It's this much code, like 35 lines altogether. It's got a cache. There's a weak map, a global weak map here that's allowing us to keep track of the state that we've assigned it without different objects. And then most of the bulk of it here is really setting things up so that our property here really becomes a getter. So like this use is really a shorthand for something more like this. Get station, return. Basically, it's kind of like this, although we rewrite it a little bit. It's actually, there's a thing called use resource, which is a low-level API that's defined in his RFC, and that wires all the things up for you in Ember. But so use is really just a shorthand for making a getter that does this fancy thing that gives you a resource that's been wired up correctly. And then the resource itself, my implementation doesn't really follow his RFC. It does more than this. Mine is very simple. It's just a class that has a run method that tracks its own state over time. And if any of the arguments change, we're going to get a new version of this created for us automatically. The RFC version is fancier. It has that mode, but then you can also optionally handle the updates directly in the class without destroying it. So it's a pretty cool pattern. But you can see the amount of code here is small. So I wanted to show it, not necessarily because it's easy to digest on the screen. There's a lot going on here. But because I'd like to encourage you that if you think this is cool, go check out the code and take the time to read it. Because it's not a lot of code. This one screen of code for the actual resource, this one screen of code for the decorator. And that's enough to implement this pattern, which is a really cool pattern. The RFC is this RFC, use and resources. So you can check that out and help us stabilize it as a thing in Ember. I also mentioned how computed getters don't memoize things automatically. This is another proposal by Chris Garrett that gives you a decorator for that actually understands the track property system. So both those are pretty nice things. And several of these are actually kind of related because destroyables would also give you the low-level pieces to do a thing that I didn't do in here, which is to make it so that this gets a clean shutdown when the component is destroyed without using any private API. You could do it today by hacking a little, the same way that Ember Concurrency and Ember Lifeline and others do. So yeah, that is it for me. I'm happy to take some questions if there's any questions. Yeah.
So about type properties, and let me preface this by saying this might be a question that is easy to answer. It might be
Sure.
You need to see the code and that will be it. But I was working recently with Lunar Component. I had a track property. When I referenced that track property in a template, it would update as you would expect when the value changed.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't actually want to display it in the template.
Mm-hmm.
I only wanted to reference it within Ember Concurrency task because I was loading data into component. I thought I was observing this problem that it would not update when I only referenced it in the concurrency task. I did not reference it in the template.
Yeah.
I was wondering
That's
if there's
probably
some
true.
idea of consuming that.
Yeah. So I would suspect that might be true. Yes. I mean, in general, for Ember concurrency, right, if you think back to pre-Octane, the patterns for Ember concurrency, if you wanted to get that kind of thing where a task would restart when a property changed, you'd use the observes modifier on a task to explicitly set up an observation so that it would cause the task to start when the property changes. You need that extra step. Now, of course, tracked properties is supposed to make things more automatic. And so a more Octane-oriented version of Ember concurrency should have that feature. I suspect it doesn't work in existing Ember concurrency, and you would need to do something else to cause it to happen. I think that's the kind of place where you can use the declarative pattern, right? So if I had a task, there's so many syntaxes now for tasks that I'm not going to know which one to use, but there's like lots of ways to write them, do the thing, right? You can still, well, let's see. Well, I would put this, I guess I would turn the question back around. Is that the task you want to kick off, what is its goal? Is it going to eventually like load some data that will show up somewhere? Is it going to, yeah. So I would suggest then making that data actually follow the pattern of being the more declarative way of doing things, right? So even if you use Ember concurrency, so in this case I did not use Ember concurrency for the station, but I totally could have. This could be an Ember concurrency task, right? And this could do the perform, and now this pattern would work, right? Because you would try to access the data you want, find that it's not there yet, kick off a task, and let the task fill the data in. And that kind of a pattern would totally work. And so that would be my suggestion as probably the best solution for that kind of situation today. I do think that the proposal for use resources does totally give us the raw materials to make an update to Ember concurrency that works with use that would do the thing you want. Because the key thing that this gives you is that these arguments here, it's handled the way you'd expect with the tracked property system, right? If the changes in tracked properties cause this to change, my resource actually gets to react to it. So this would actually be like task from Ember concurrency, and it would be made to work with a resource with use, and then it could do the thing. But I think today it's just not a thing. Probably you could even use the patterns that I have in here, like the user space use thing, to make a new version of task that wraps Ember concurrency around. Like this could actually probably be a function star. This could be like where you actually do your task. You could write this thing, right, and pass it under the hood, pass it to Ember concurrency and set up a real task and do this as a wrapper around it until there's a more stable official one. You could try those kind of patterns. I think it would work. Anybody else? Questions? Jen?
I have a general JavaScript conventions question.
Sure.
I saw in the use code that you showed usage of class with a K. I've seen
yes.
that a bunch.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Can you tell me a little bit
Why did I do
more
that?
about why did
Sure.
you use that?
Yeah, well, because the thing here is a class. But if I say class, that's a keyword that you can't use here, right?
It's a class, not an instance of.
Yeah, exactly. It's an actual class, right? So like another place you might see that would be something like choose implementation, right? And if y equals true, return component. Actually, let's just show them all. Import component from Ember component. Import Glimmer component from Glimmer component. Return else. Return Glimmer. So if I was writing some other code elsewhere, that might be like let class equals choose implementation. Right. That's why I've named it that way. And now, because now it lets you do a somewhat natural thing, which would be like new class. And now it looks the way you'd expect, where it's still like a capital thing. In fact, I think some lint rules will even be mad at you if you use a lowercase thing for new. I guess not always, but it's basically style. You could have named it anything. It is just a variable, but class with a K is just like a cute way of saying this is a class, but I don't want to collide with the JavaScript keyword. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yes.
So something that, a pattern that we kind of experimented with, but I'm not sure is good, but is to use the did update modifier for a decorative way to trigger rerun or something. So like,
Yes.
how do you feel about that?
I think it's a hack for sure, and I think people should get away from it. I think so. Yeah, so that was in the context of the original questions and conversations that inspired my topic, because people did suggest that as a solution, right? And so for folks who haven't seen it, the way to do that would be here was my declarative one, right? I decided to make station be computed, but the alternative would be instead of this, I would still have like a load the station method. I would probably make it into an action so that I can call it from a template easily. And then I would, in my Declarative Station HBS, I would do something like, well, assuming I have some element, I'd be like did update. If the ID updates, then call my load the station thing. The other way, orders the other way, yeah, exactly. So it's basically do this thing if this thing changes, right? And so it's like a hack to let you sneak, basically an observer. It's an observer, yeah. And it works, but I don't think it's the best pattern. But so the thing is, observers are still in Ember, and the reason they are is because there are legitimate use cases. So they're fewer and farther between than people think, which is why the observers have such a reputation as being a pitfall. Most people who reach for one are reaching, and this is very central to the topic of my talk here, really, which is that it does take experience to begin to see the difference between imperative and declarative, and like saying what you want versus saying how to do it is a subtle distinction, especially when you're learning. But it's a fairly clear distinction when you get the experience to see it, but it takes practice. And when you miss that distinction, it's very easy to reach for imperative things. What you say is, I know how to write the code to update all these things. I just need something to call my code. And you just like, call my code. I know what the code should be. And so you reach for something imperative that will call your code. And so the legitimate reason you need that is if you're trying to get something to synchronize from Ember world, where there's data changing in Ember, out to something not Ember. So if there's some third-party library that needs to hear updates from you, or there's some like hardware API you're talking to that needs to hear updates from you, those are reasons to use an observer, and that's like the legit reason. And in Glimmer components, it's a legitimate hole that was missing, and that is actually why the use RFC is there right now, because it's intended to plug that hole. Use would let you do that stuff in a way, though, that is hopefully declarative and doesn't rely on the side effects of touching DOM, right? Yeah, exactly. Cool, good question. All right, anybody else? Thank you. Oh, I should share the repo, right? Just so you can see it right away, and we can post it, of course. But what did I name it? Jan 2020 meetup something. No, I don't remember. And I'm still on my incognito browser, so it's not there. I have things. There it is. January 2020 meetup example. Okay, that is the repo. January 2020 meetup example. So that's all the code I was just running. And as I said, just look at the router map because it lists what all the routes are. And because like if you just boot it, it'll be a blank screen. There's no welcome page. So if you just go to any of the routes /1, you'll get the first station in that example. And all the code is there. Cool, thanks.
Can you run my slides? Can you run my slides? Because my laptop.
Oh, sure.
It's Google Slides?
Yeah, I can, well,
Whichever
actually,
is
I have
easier.
them right here. So.
Okay, if you're already on, that's good.
It's not the meetup slides, it's a link I sent you on Discord. Oh man, I missed it. With your face behind your face. here. Yes, that is. And line, what did I say, 41?
That was another example of Discord.
Yeah.
Because there's a pop-up there.
Yeah, close enough. There. Okay. All right, so tonight I have a short lightning talk that is a sneak peek of something that Katie Gambler and I are going to be giving at EmberConf as a workshop coming up this March. So who here has used Ember add-ons? Cool. And who here has written their own Ember add-on? All right, and who has contributed to somebody else's add-on? Okay, cool. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is we'll cover first briefly what add-ons are, what Octane is, and then I'll jump into some things that Katie shared with me about how what does Octane actually mean for add-ons? What can an add-on do to use some of the latest things in Ember without breaking their compatibility for apps that are older than the Octane version? So, all right, so the first thing is, what is Octane? What is add-ons? Octane is the it's kind of hard to give a really succinct definition of it, but it's the most recent modern patterns for how to write an Ember app. If an Ember app is Octane, that means it has some configuration flags enabled. It has syntax like Ed showed us with struct and glimmer components. And it's overall, in my opinion, a better experience for building web apps. And it was released right at the end of 2019. Add-ons are Ember's word for NPM packages that are made especially for Ember. One of the things that makes them special compared to your average NPM package is that a lot of add-ons are quite backwards compatible. You could be running, a 3.0 app and install the latest version of a lot of popular add-ons, and it's gonna work. I can't say that that's been my experience for other JavaScript libraries, other JavaScript, platform systems, frameworks. Sometimes there's questions about what works well together. And that kind of compatibility is partly by design in Ember and Ember add-ons, and it's partly from the hard work of the people who write these add-ons to keep them backwards compatible across time. So you have two options when you're writing an add-on. You can make your add-on Octane ready, which means that people who are using Octane for their own apps who want to use your add-on, they're not going to run into, lots of warnings and errors and things. That's Octane ready. There's also, you could just write your add-on using totally Octane style, all of the same sorts of things. If you want to make a component that you export as part of your library and you want it to be a Glimmer component, you can, but it's not going to work for those older apps who might try to use your add-on. So Octane ready is kind of for any add-on that already exists in the ecosystem is really the thing to aim for because it helps support people who aren't on Octane yet, which I would say is probably, you hear it in Ember Meetup, probably a lot of you have used Octane, but I bet if we had a magic ball that let us run some statistics, we would see that not everybody, the majority of people are probably not on Octane, they may not even know what it is. I don't follow the newsletters of Lodash, right? Ooh, what's the new Lodash thing? I don't know. So we're gonna go through a couple things, do's and don'ts. So even if you're not an add-on author yourself, if you come across these sorts of things and you want to contribute, these are some of the best practices to aim for. So if you are working with an add-on and you want to have good compatibility,
with Octane apps and non-Octane apps, you can still use the latest version of Ember. This is because, again, the things that make Octane special are configuration flags. So even if you're not updating any of the syntax, you can still be on the latest versions of Ember Source, Ember CLI, Ember Data. If you want to, you can still use jQuery. The difference is that in older Ember apps, you could do import, or you could just say this $. So you say this $$ and your DOM selector inside. That was referred to as the jQuery integration APIs. It was when jQuery came in automatically with Ember apps. And Octane is not there automatically anymore, but you can still use it. Plenty of UI libraries rely on it. So all you have to do, if you still need to use jQuery, is instead of trying to do this $, you can install @ember/jQuery and then import $, from @ember/jQuery. Whenever you're working in a compatible add-on, all of your component templates should have a component JavaScript file. That's not a requirement anymore for Octane apps, but older apps won't know what to do with it if it's just the template by itself. So you always want to have these two things here together. And you want to keep them in what's referred to as the classic layout. So in Octane, you can put your component JavaScript and your template together in this file as happy neighbors. And in Classic, they had to live far away.
You mean that directory?
Huh?
You said that file that would be.
Oh yeah, the directory, yeah.
Just not to confuse it.
Thank you. So they used to live far away. Now you need to maintain that pattern in your add-on again, so that people with older apps, their app knows what to do with these files. Another do is to check out what's in the Ember try for the add-on. So if you're not familiar with Ember try, it's a list of the versions of Ember apps that your add-on gets tested against. So I'll give an example. We have a library at CardStack. It's a UI components library. And whenever we run our CI tests, it runs for all of the versions that are listed in our Ember try file. So I know if I'm using an API that's new and needs a polyfill, it's gonna break, and I will see that. On the flip side, if I am using a paid service like Percy to take snapshots, and I have 8 versions in my Ember try, and I run that test for 3 different screen widths, you can really burn through your Percy budget real fast, and within the last month. So check out the Ember try file. Make sure that you're covering the LTS versions of Ember. LTS stands for long-term support. They are the versions of Ember that receive ongoing bug fixes and a really long tail of security fixes. So for example, let's say a dependency of Ember, oh no, there's an NPM package vulnerability for something that we use. It'll get those kinds of updates. And LTS versions are usually every 4 versions or so. So the most recent LTS was, 3.12? Yeah. The next thing you need to do is to use async observers, which means you mark your observers as sync false. In Octane apps, observers are async by default. And this last argument here that you pass to @observer, that false there, that's something that's new in Ember. That's a new option. And so you need to install a polyfill to make that work. Does anyone have a favorite definition for polyfills? I didn't actually know what a polyfill was until a couple years in my web development career. Anyone want to give it a shot, explain what a polyfill is? Yeah, sure.
It provides, it's basically a backfiller so that if you're running a system that doesn't support cool new feature, you can find a way to make a cool new feature happen in, JavaScript or whatever language and insert it into the code base of the store.
Yep, so you can be using an older version of something but still get new features available. So I just have some examples here. This is another, this is sort of the different way of declaring an observer, but still where you could be passing in sync false over here. Since most of the time when we work with observers, we don't actually write add observer. All right, so don't do these things. If you want your add-ons to work with older Ember apps, don't use Glimmer components. You can use native classic components, which look an awful lot like Glimmer components and can help you not break your stride when you're bouncing between an app and an add-on development. But in an add-on, you shouldn't use Glimmer components. You're making a face at me.
No, I think you're right.
Okay, I hope I'm right. I'm also testing to make sure that this is accurate
Yeah.
because before I go teach a whole bunch of people at EmberConf, so.
You're definitely right. It would be nice if we could polyfill more of it, but some of it's quite hard to polyfill.
Yeah, I think this one might be a tough one.
Most of the track properties, actually. There is a polyfill for Glimmer component called Sparkles.
That's true.
Yeah.
I don't know how
But it
that,
doesn't have all the track properties and stuff, so it's kind of not really Glimmer components.
as we talked about earlier, your component files need to be in their classic locations. They can't be neighbors here in the component file. This is referred to as template co-location when your template and your JavaScript live together in the same directory. Don't use template-only components every time. For every template you have in your add-on, it needs its JavaScript.
Your example is backwards.
Is it? Don't use template-only components.
You have a JavaScript only component on the picture.
Oh, I do. Thank you.
Yeah.
I will fix that. Don't use tracked. Kind of don't use, Glimmer components. Tracked comes from Glimmer. Don't use this $sign or ever $sign. We've got other ways to use jQuery. And then lastly, I want to go through a couple of things that are just quality of life syntax. So it can be a little jarring to work between a classic Ember app and an Octane app. I was doing that for a good 6 months or so. But there's some things that you can do to help smooth things out so they all feel familiar. This is a list that Katie suggested. You can run a whole bunch of different code mods. You can run ES5 getters, native classes code mods. In your templates, you can use this dot to refer to the component's own properties. And then you can run the angle brackets code mod. And if you're aiming for really great backwards compatibility, you can install a polyfill that will let you use angle brackets and still have your add-on working for people who are on Ember 3.0, for example. All right, so that's what I have for this. This content is getting turned into the workshop material, but it's also going to go into the CLI guides so that this is available for everybody. If you have any feedback for me, anything that you think needs to be added, anything I'm missing, any difficult patterns you run into, I'd love to incorporate that into those materials, so just let me know. Any questions?
So, using Glimmer components, is that because the host application that the add-on gets built into doesn't have the correct resolver? Like a resolver problem?
I have no idea.
You're asking why not to use Glimmer components?
Well, I understand that you can't really use them because they won't work in the host application. But is it because the resolver in the host is an older version? The add-on?
I'm not sure, but I can ask around and look it up.
This isn't about add-ons specifically, but about template co-location. So template co-location, I love it. But I have a aesthetic question.
Mm-hmm.
So in the examples, you just have the handlebars and the JavaScript files right next to each other within app/components.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to also work if you say app/component/my component name. And then within that, you have component.js or whatever. Is that meant to work in both formats?
I
Using
don't know.
pods?
Yeah.
Pods?
Yeah,
Because index works. You can do
Yeah.
index.js and index.hps, certainly, those are interchangeable. But if you're doing component.js, that,
if that works, it's probably because your pod
You
thing
just
is
have pods.
accidentally working. Yeah.
Your extension, it works. I mean, app/components/ my-component.js and my-component.hps.
That's the standard code,
Mhm.
right? That's the normal thing to do now.
you can do my-component /
Index.
directory index.js and index.hps. That's also a template location. That's another version
That
of
works,
the
yeah.
location.
Personally, my own stylistic preference, and this is just my opinion as a developer who's building Ember apps, I really like my components to have their name in the file name, just because that's how I navigate through the project structure. I almost never use, my little file picker on the side of VS Code. I jump straight to my component.js. And just that little convenience, I think is helpful to me, but also especially helpful when I am bringing someone new onto the team. It can be kind of overwhelming to have 150 files on named component.js or index.js. So for me, I really much prefer to just have the file names as they are.
Just to comment on that, something that we talked about in my org is to not use the index thing, keep them together, but use nesting well, because
Oh,
when
yeah.
you go back to invocation, you have a nice way to invoke basically a namespace for components. So sort of organize them like that so you know, because they're not nested in this giant directory of components and templates.
Yeah.
But
So for everyone who's listening in remote, the comment there was that it can also be really nice to nest your components so that you could have, components /buttons /primary.js, primary.hps is a way to organize your project. And you can generate those nested file structures straight from the CLI. So if you do Ember generate component buttons /primary, that'll get you what you need.
another question. So you mentioned native class syntax for classic components.
Mm-hmm.
Is that officially supported now?
It is.
Okay. I mean, I know it's always worked, but I thought the stance was that
Yeah,
it didn't teach that and that wasn't officially supported.
correct. Yes. I think that now that the docs there are certainly gotchas. Depending on how far back you want to support, it gets very painful to try to write an add-on that uses native syntax. I've done that. It's not fun because the rules about how constructors work have changed over time. So it's you can do it, but caveat emptor, I guess. And the reason though that it does work is that it kind of has to the meaning of class syntax in JavaScript, the language really is that it's equivalent to the thing you would have written otherwise. It's really just a syntactic change. It's supposed to be the same semantics, so we couldn't really even make it not work. It's just that there are those few weird little rough spots, how does constructor and init relate to each other that get people. Yeah.
All right. So that's it for tonight's Ember meetup. Thanks so much for coming. Hope you all come again sometime soon. Please take hot chocolate and more pizza. I plan to go out for fancy drinks after this, so if anyone wants to come along, you're welcome. Are we going to go to Carrie Nation? Probably going to go to Carrie Nation. Yeah, it's a good place. All right, thank you.
Yeah.